Record. All right. All right. So if you're shy about having your face show up on social media, we will be recording this, and I will be posting the recording onto Skagway Swap and Skagway Bulletin Board and the STC Facebook page after this. So just keep your camera off if you don't want your face out there for everyone to see. And yeah. So if you didn't get the chat link, I'll put the link to this poll back in the chat again, and I'll also change this over. If you've got a QR code reader, you can just scan that and it should take you directly to the poll. And we're just kind of looking to gauge what people's level of concern is over geohazards here in the wonderful city of Skagway. I see. Yeah, no problem, man. I just saw that in the chat. Yeah, having not been to Skagway, you probably don't have a good notion of how concerned you would be about a natural disaster. So that's perfectly okay. But welcome. Have you already arrived in Skagway? In a week? All right. Well, good luck with the travel, and hopefully the weather will be cooperating a little more. It's been in the 30s and a stiff north wind blowing for weeks on end. It does get nicer. Maybe we can switch it up here. Oh, 85. Yeah, it's gonna be bring an extra fleece. It's a little chillier than 85 up here. I'm going to move on to this part of the quiz here. And with this, you just enter in whatever words or whatever association. When you hear the term geohazard, just go ahead and type in what you think of when you think of geohazard. So I'm going to enter in my thoughts.
I can add a few thoughts as well.
All right. Anna, I'm going to enter in yours because I like that.
I also see a comment about river sediment and tsunamis in the chat.
River sediment and tsunamis. I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah. They might be two separate points, but they're listed in the chat as well.
All right, these are all good thoughts, you guys. Well, what do you think, Annette? Should we get rolling?
Yeah, that sounds great. These responses are really interesting, and I see a lot of themes coming out about geology and ocean hazards and rivers. So this is really interesting to hear what comes to mind for you folks. But I can go ahead and get started and sort of give a brief little spiel about the work that we've done so far in Sitka, as well as some of the ideas that we have for research elsewhere in Alaska. Do you have anything else you want to kick us off with?
Just to introduce you, everybody, this is Annette Patton. She is the geoscience lead for the Geohazards monitoring project at the Sitka Sound Science Center. She's been gracious enough to join us this evening all the way from beautiful Sitka to clue us into what this project is all about. So Annette, I'll let you just take it away.
Sounds great. So I don't have a formal presentation or anything, and the main purpose that I have for meeting with you folks tonight is that I really am curious to hear what you folks have in terms of questions and feedback about the project that we're planning. So I'll start by just describing some of the work that we've already done based in Sitka, and then some of our plans for expanding that network. And I joined this project several years ago as a geology researcher. I was based in, well, I actually still am based in Oregon, at the University of Oregon. And I came onto this project a couple of years later, a couple of years after it started, but the project really began in August of 2015. There was a really large rain event in Southeast Alaska and with really heavy precipitation in Sitka, Alaska. And that storm triggered multiple landslides around Sitka, including, unfortunately, one landslide that resulted in 3 fatalities. And I think you folks maybe have an idea of the fact that in a community in Southeast Alaska, you know, that loss was really felt. That had a big impact on the community and the people who lived there at the time. And so they started reaching out to various scientific organizations, including the Sitka Sound Science Center, and then through the Science Center to other federal, state organizations who do various kinds of research. And in response to that event, the Science Center helped start something that they called the Geo Task Force to really get a few experts in the room to talk about hazards and risk. Because this, you know, this landslide was a risk that folks hadn't really thought about in Sitka before. Maybe they'd seen landslides, maybe they knew they happened, but it felt, I think, a little bit more tangible. And the community and this Geo Task Force, they really started to think about some of the questions like, you know, what should we ask or what should we know in order to better understand and manage our risk from landslides? So out of those conversations, The Science Center found a couple of collaborators, some experts in various fields, and applied for National Science Foundation funding to research the hazards. And they came up with a couple of questions, and specifically some of the geoscientists that they talked to started saying like, well, you know, if we knew more about the rainfall that was going to happen and how rainfall might trigger landslides, or if we knew how wet the soils were before it rained, we might be able to forecast when landslides are more likely to happen. So that's where I came in. I joined the project to help put equipment in the ground to measure how wet the soils are, to measure how much rain was falling, and to work with some of the other members of the team to think about how that might all relate to risk in a meaningful way. So in addition to the nerdy data-driven geologists that I was, we also were working with social scientists who thought a lot about how we communicate risk. We were talking to community emergency managers and emergency planners, think about what sort of messaging that they would be comfortable with or what would make sense for them. And what started as this sort of simple plan to predict landslides and push a button, send off a siren, it changed a lot over the course of the project. Built into this sort of plan were a lot of opportunities to gain feedback from the community, and some workshops and other interviews and things like that. And for example, one of the things that we learned by working with the community and by partnering with the community is that, you know, pushing a button and like sounding a siren didn't make sense for the community of Sitka. First of all, they said, well, you know, we already have a tsunami siren. So if the siren goes off, should we run uphill or should we run downhill? That's going to be really confusing. So we kind of went back to the table and we were like, yeah, that makes sense. But we also, you know, maybe at a deeper level, learned more about the way that different individuals were comfortable with risk. We talked to some folks who were pretty risk averse and they wanted to know every time a landslide might happen. But we also talked to some folks who are a little bit more tolerant, and we really recognize that there's a lot of individuality in how individuals think about landslide risk. And unlike, you know, maybe a pandemic or other risks where one person's actions influence a lot of people, with a landslide, the risks or the actions that one person take are a little bit more individualized. So instead of, you know, a single button that the fire chief pushed, we started working towards building a public-facing web portal or a dashboard where individuals could access contextualized information about current conditions with past events, things like that. And we started building in forecasting models, but also communicating them to the general public in a way that we're hoping will make sense. We're actually about to roll out our public website, probably late next month, maybe a little bit after that. And that's going to be this public-facing portal with some model-driven hazards assessments. So folks can look at the raw data if they want to, but they can also get a really simplified sort of risk category from low, medium to high. So there are a couple of other components of this project that I also want to highlight. The first is that it's a really interdisciplinary team. I am a geoscientist, so I think a lot about the landslide process and the dirt and the hill slopes and, you know, how steep does a hill slope have to be for a landslide to happen. But we have a really broad skill set on the team, including some social scientists, as well as the risk managers. I think I mentioned that. And we also have local partners. So the Science Center is a local partner for this project. We also have partnered with the Sitka tribe of Alaska. And Tammy Young at the Sitka tribe conducted some interviews with tribal citizens to understand both short-term and long-term understanding and knowledge about landslides and other hazards in Sitka. And that's really informed the way that we understand landslides in Sitka and also in Southeast Alaska. Another component of the project that's had to adapt over time, when we started doing this work and working with Sitka, our primary focus, our primary goal was to protect human life and safety. So that, that's the main goal. I think most folks that we talk to agree that that's probably a primary purpose for a landslide warning system. But over the course of the project, we also got a lot of feedback that people cared, that was of course the primary priority, but people also cared about their homes. And they were starting to find repercussions for not being able to find insurance for landslides, maybe not being able to find mortgages for their homes. So we also went back to the Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and said, we have some additional needs that have been identified by the community. And we got some additional funding and developed, hosted a workshop about insurance and how, what some of the options might be for maybe the state or the region to obtain landslide insurance. And we got, everybody in the same room, the state insurance commissioner, some homeowners, some brokers, just tried to get everyone in the room and had a conversation about the challenges and some options that might work for Sitka. So there's been a lot of sort of response and adaptation that's really come out of this partnership with Sitka. It's gone, it's been a two-way street, which is really exciting. And as Ruben mentioned, landslides don't just happen in Sitka. Landslides have occurred throughout Southeast Alaska for a long time, but notably in the last, in human recollection, there have been a couple of important landslide disasters. And so as we've been working on this project, we've started to get other communities reaching out to us, asking how they could apply what we've attempted in Sitka and how they could learn from what we've done. So recently, we just received an entirely new grant from the National Science Foundation to expand some of this monitoring that we've done to other communities in Southeast Alaska. Skagway, for example, Skagway Traditional wrote a letter of support for our proposal. So we have a couple of partnerships already established, but we really want to make sure that this is research that these communities are like Skagway are interested in. So right now, what we just received the funding. It's been a long process. It's been a while since we received those letters of support. So we want to come back and sort of give you this update, say we've got the money in hand now, and ask what you folks are interested in or what you're concerned about if you are interested in partnering on research like this. We've added a couple of folks to the team based on some of what we've learned in Sitka. We brought in an atmospheric scientist who thinks a lot about the weather that causes landslides and other natural disasters. We've added a hydrologist to the team who's got some expertise in flooding and rivers. So we've built out the team. We have this level of expertise, but we understand that our partnerships with local organizations are the only way to make this project work. So first of all, if communities like Skagway are interested in partnering, that's an important step. But there's also a lot that we want to be able to learn from you folks about what concerns you have, what anxieties you have, what geohazards you would like to understand better. So that's where we are now, here kind of starting to ask those questions to see where we can go in the future. I'm happy to answer any questions. I wanted to leave a lot of time to sort of discuss and chat. So feel free to. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Annette. Yeah, if you guys want to, if you have questions, go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can just pop them into the chat. I know I have a question. If I might ask a question, one of the things that I know that was kind of a driving force for this was focusing somewhat on subsistence harvesting, the availability of subsistence foods, and that's not important only to Indigenous people, but as Alaskans, a lot of Alaskans rely pretty heavily on subsistence foods just because of where we are, our isolation. So being able to pull up some shellfish from the intertidal zone, or go out and drop a crab pot out in the bay and pull up crab or shrimp, catching salmon or hooligan are about to start running up here. You know, these are all important sources of food for a lot of people. One of the things that occurred for us last year, I believe it was in the middle of July, as we had a huge blue mussel die off. Just a whole swath of blue mussels just all of a sudden detached from the substrate and started floating up onto the beaches and dying.
Yeah.
It was a pretty severe event. And you know, right now, Skagway Traditional Council does weekly monitoring out in Naku Bay. You know, we look at things like salinity and temperature and pH and all that stuff, but we're only looking at this very discrete moment in time. You know, we get one moment every, you know, Thursday or Friday or whatever low tide that we go to, and then the rest of the time it's all, you know, it could go up or down either way. And I feel like that's a big data gap for us, not really understanding, you know, what did the salinity do continuously, you know, not just this one moment in time where we captured those data. So is that something that could be incorporated into into this monitoring network, like setting up some telemetry sensors that are continuously collecting things like pH and salinity?
Yeah, you know, I've heard a couple of questions about like berries and other subsistence foods, and I think it really speaks to the interconnected nature of a lot of these processes. You know, the rain and the weather and the climate, they're all impacting the landscape in a lot of different ways. So, you know, the team that we have assembled right now is a team of experts, including, you know, geoscientists, atmospheric scientists, but we have intentionally left a little bit of wiggle room in terms of exactly what sensing equipment we want to put out, where we put it, because we do want to be able to meet some of the needs. And each community we expect is going to be a little different. You know, some folks already have a lot of really rich data, and some folks have desire for additional data and sensors and things like that. So we'd be happy to chat about what that could look like.
Awesome. Hey, welcome, Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
I'm so sorry. I had the time wrong. I'm running to my.
No problem, Lisa. I just gave a little bit of a spiel about where we've come from, and the fact that we're starting to build out plans for where to go next, and asking questions now what folks are curious about or concerned about.
I'm so sorry I missed my part, the jumping in part of the introduction, but I guess the message that I want to get across, I'll just say it short in brief, is that we have spent the last years developing this great team of scientists and researchers who have experience now working in a rural community. And we would love to share that team with you and your community, but only if you want that, you know, only if Skagway wants us to bring this team into your community.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Lisa. You said it much more eloquently than I did.
So I see a comment from Dimitri that I missed earlier in the chat. Dimitri says, over the last several years, there have been slides running from the Pacific Northeast all the way up to the Hall Road in the Arctic. And while I understand a lot of this is caused by warming, there's a story in the Anchorage Daily News and the recent PBS piece on exploding Arctic sinkholes and the huge slide in Haines in 2020, slides in Dai, et cetera. Since they have occurred in the Ring of Fire and along several fault lines, does this mean the mantle itself and perhaps the layer under it is becoming unstable?
Oh, those are some big questions. I don't know that I have an immediate answer for that, but I think I hear big questions about how the climate and the geologic processes that we see at, in our communities and in our homes are changing. And those are exactly the questions that I think we want to keep pursuing and learn more about. I do also, I think I saw a comment about like warming permafrost earlier in the chat. And, that's, I think, another question that, I've spent the last few years in Sitka. Lisa lives in Sitka. We've developed some understanding of what works there, but there's a lot, I think it would be really important as we're starting to build some of these new relationships. And if we were to come do research in Skagway, we would really want to put in the time to learn more about how Skagway is different from Sitka. So permafrost and, volcanic, proximity to volcanoes, that's all going to be a little bit different. So there's some room to learn some of that context.
Yeah, Skagway is definitely quite different from most of the rest of Southeast. I've noticed this. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so I was expecting to see cedar trees and ferns, and I'm surrounded by forests of pines and more kind of continental plants. I've heard Skagway referred to as the desert of the Southeast because it is very, very dry here. We notice it on our hands, on those brisk, windy days. It's not the wet rainforest that you might think of. So it definitely has its own. It's in its own class, compared to other Southeast communities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One thing, I didn't hear, obviously what Annette said, but if there were questions that people had about Sitka's experience, as a small Southeast Alaska community and how we kind of started to tackle some of these questions and sort of our approach to these kind of big issues, natural hazard issues. If people had questions about that, if I can talk about that.
At least I described a little bit how sort of the original Sitka landslide project kind of came out of the big 2015 storm, some of the questions from the community, but you might be able to describe a little bit more in detail how Sitka decided to tackle those questions.
Yeah, I think from our community perspective, what the approach that we took was we wanted people to feel safer and less anxious. And we went to the scientific community, excuse me, and we said to the scientific community, what do you need to know? What do you need to answer in order to help us feel less anxious? And so that was kind of the approach. And it was really a community-based research project where the community was, driving what the scientists were answering, what the scientists were trying to answer. We were driving the questions. And I think it's a lovely approach in a lot of ways, because we really push the scientists to keep on sort of the practical side of things. And that there are a lot of and I would say a lot of interesting geologic information came from this, but the core of the research project, the core of the project was really about answering community concerns, and that would be our hope in coming to Skagway is that same approach. And so it really, really does have to be something the community wants and is interested in it. And from our discussions in advance of this meeting, it sounded like Skagway was interested in that, which I'm excited about.
So in the chat, Anna's asking, she says she's a Pacific Northwest resident of 22 years and hears often that landslides occur by the railroad tracks. Is there any risk in Skagway near the railroad to White Pass?
I mean, that's something that we can get into, and that would be part of the project is mapping the area and kind of figuring out where are the places near Skagway that you want to take a closer look at. But we don't have the answer to that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just
see. Oh, go ahead, Ruben.
You go ahead.
I see that we are already finding the perfect sources to answer some of those questions, though. Paul in the chat has described that there have been some slides that have closed the railway at times. So perfect example of the fact that you folks know your community a lot more than we do. And we're really excited to ask you a lot of questions too.
But interestingly, there are a few other landslide warning systems in the country, and one of them is north of Seattle. That is a private landslide warning system that the railroad helped develop, and they learned about mudslides coming into the railway, and so that's just another resource for us.
Yeah, from what I understand, I think anytime you're gonna cut a thoroughfare through the landscape, you're gonna just kind of tip the scales towards triggering something like a landslide. If the slope is already steep, and all of a sudden you take material out so that you can have your railroad or your roadway. I know logging roads in the Pacific Northwest and particularly on Prince of Wales Island here in Southeast, they've been pretty highly associated with a higher risk of landslides, just because you're removing material, you're manipulating the landscape, and just weakening it in general by having those thoroughfares through there. So I would say probably the railroad would have it would have an effect on the capacity of a slope to slide. And Paul says it was a serious economic event when White Pass's tracks was closed for several days. I think I was here for that. If that was back in 2019, it was the first time that I've seen 13,000 people actually in town because they didn't have a train to ride up and out of town. It was pretty nuts.
Yeah. I'm curious too. I don't know if people feel comfortable with this question, but is there a sense of anxiety? Is there a sense of worry in Skagway about landslides, just sort of in your everyday life when you have big rains?
Paul says the slide at the railroad cruise ship dock is a significant hazard that people are exposed to daily, especially in the summer season. And I can definitely back this up. We have a little breakwater at the opening of the small boat harbor where people throw crab pots off, and I'm down there looking at birds all the time. And it worries me being there because if a big release were to happen, there's nothing in between me and the gigantic tidal wave that would occur if a huge amount of material went in there.
Yeah.
And Dimitri says there was a huge underwater slide before 1998 that destroyed the cruise ship dock next to the mountainside. So that's the railroad dock, same kind of area, but this was underwater.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember. A lot of geologic activity happening in our neck of the woods.
Mhm.
Maybe I would love to pose a question to all of you, which is, we've talked a little bit about landslides, but if there were, a couple of hazards that you could identify as those that you're most anxious about, what all would be on that list? We've kind of teased that idea, but see tsunami in the chat. Earthquakes.
Yeah.
I'm personally concerned about glacial lake outbursts, because I know up in Norse Creek we do have two they're dammed by the toe of a couple of glaciers, big bodies of water that are kind of perched up, and there have been outbursts in Dai before. I think one happened back in the 90s. I wasn't here for it, but I've definitely heard stories about it.
So is flooding part of that concern then, Ruben?
I think that would be the main concern, just because that pulse would be so acute and so quick, because it doesn't have very far to travel. I think the one that occurred in the 90s came from the West Creek Basin, so that's been cleared out. But there are, I believe, if the map is correct, there are 3 perched lakes now. One of them is just being held back by an old moraine, but 2 of them are being held back by actual bodies of ice. So as things warm up, that could become something of concern.
Okay.
And Dimitri's wondering if all of these events are linked somehow. So landslides, glacial lake outbursts, definitely climate linked, I would say.
Yeah, there are definitely some themes of climate and weather at the short term influencing a lot of these processes.
Again, I'm so sorry for being late. I just got my times reversed for tomorrow night and tonight. But one of the things that project aims to do, it has an education component as well. And so the idea is that, and I'll just, again, tell you from our community's experience, we have, at the Science Center, we have scientists who are coming into our community all the time. And a while back, we decided to harness that expertise and that energy in a very strategic and planned and careful way. And so we have a very well-oiled machine of a scientist in the schools program here. And we coordinate with teachers in the school district when scientists are coming into town, if they want scientists in their classrooms, and when they want the scientists in their classrooms, at what time of their curriculum. So it fits in well with their curriculum. And then we go in as a science center and we do pre-lessons before that scientist arrives. And then we help the scientists learn about the educational parameters of classrooms and what the developmental skills are of the students and where the students are in the curriculum. And then we help the scientists, design a superstar activity, and they feel great about it, and the students feel great about it. And the students get exposure to a whole bunch of different kind of scientific disciplines. And in this project, and again, this is just, if Skagway wants it, we have designed in that scientists in the schools component, so that when if Skagway wants this, we could have the scientists, basically we would train them, and we would help coordinate with the school district along with your community connector. And then those scientists could be training students in your schools on different things, but they could be trained on the geoscience techniques and the equipment needed to monitor these natural hazards that you're interested in. And the Oregon State University would be involved in that part of the project, and they have something at Oregon State called it's a kind of maker's lab. It's like a maker's lab on steroids that's funded by the National Science Foundation. And they would have sort of engineering students from that lab who would help with that program.
Fantastic. Yeah, I know our Skagway kids definitely like a little bit of science. So I think they would be more than happy to learn about some of the gadgets that are used in the science to take all these measurements and gather the data.
Yeah, and then thing that other communities have asked, maybe you already asked this, I'm sorry again that I missed the beginning, but is about sustainability of the, talk about that already, or?
No, you should go for it, Lisa.
Okay. So a lot of communities are saying, okay, this is great. You come in for a few years, 5 years, but then what happens after the 5 years of the grant is over? And what we're working on right now is going back to the National Science Foundation, and there's a program called the Arctic Observing Network, and they fund natural monitoring or monitoring of the natural world in the Arctic, and Southeast Alaska is considered the Arctic by National Science Foundation. And we're asking them for funding for data management and for maintenance of this network over time. And it's the kind of thing, I mean, of course, no guarantees that we're going to get it, but it's the kind of thing that you can apply again every 5 years. So we could be sustained through the National Science Foundation for quite a while. And then the other place we're going to go is and we've talked to Senator Murkowski's office about this, is the U.S. Geologic Survey. And Senator Murkowski has been quite instrumental in getting more money in the landslide research division of the U.S. Geologic Survey. And so we've talked to her about putting even more money in for monitoring networks, helping maintain networks like ours. So that's kind of our second tier of hope there for sustainability. And then the other thing, I don't know if Annette talked about, is part of halfway through our project, when we kind of went into the project thinking, we're going to help protect lives so people know when to get out of their houses. But what we found was people were really also interested in protecting their homes and their property. And so we had a whole insurance research component of this project. And what we will do with the next phase of this project is share that research with Skagway. So you'll, know, like basically they researched what are the options. We're not the only place in America that has landslides, and how do they deal with landslide insurance in other places, and kind of investigated some of the myths that were sort of being spread, like you can't get a mortgage if you can't get landslide insurance. It turns out that's not true. And so far, it has not impacted property values. In fact, au contraire, but I'm not saying that that's not a possibility in the future, but there were like some of the country's best insurance experts did a bunch of research on the insurance side of things. So we'll share that with you as well.
I never knew landslide or insurance in general could be so exciting, but it was actually really fascinating to learn about all of these different insurance schemes and methods, and it was really interesting information.
Yeah, and we've gotten, as part of that part of the project, we've gotten the state commissioner on insurance interested in helping with this issue. And she attended our workshop, and she's been very gung-ho about that. So that's been kind of a cool part of the project. And again, that came from the community, that came from the community saying, okay, enough with the geoscience stuff. We want to know about our property values, or is this research hurting our property values? That was kind of one of the first things that came out. And in fact, one of the insurance agents came up to me early on in the project, and he said, this project is really hurting, and it's going to really hurt property values. And then and then by the end, I mean, towards like, this has been a 4-year project for us. At the end of it, he was very gung-ho. He's very gung-ho about the project and about sharing the information that the project is finding out about with the community and developing maps that will better inform insurance and things like that. So he's come around.
That's great. I'm really happy to hear about the longevity plan, because I know with a lot of these projects, you know, you can get them all set up and they're ready to go and wound up, and then all of a sudden the funding drops out, and what do you do? So it's good to think, you know, 10 steps ahead whenever you can. So that's nice to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is a little bit, and this, I mean, I say this at the beginning so that you all know about it, but it's also a little bit about developing a constituency of people who are really interested, you know, and I think this is important. So we've spent a fair amount of time, you know, going to the Sitka Tribal Council, going to the City and Borough Assembly, going to Planning and Zoning, talking to the local Emergency Planning Commission, telling the radio station, telling the newspaper, giving them updates as it goes, as a way, you know, of course, to engage the community, but also to kind of build a constituency of people who think this stuff is important. And I guess maybe this is naive nonprofit woman, but I always think like where there's a will, there's a way. You know, if people really want it, we'll find a way to maintain it. So that kind of has to happen, you know, side by side.
Certainly. Dimitra had a question. At the Lawton Glacier in the 90s, it was easy to climb up on the moraine and you were right on the glacier. Now the river has been supplemented by glacial melt and you have to climb way around it. Are there any plans to measure the amount of the glacial melt around Skagway, like a historical record, since there were active photographers there from Klondike Gold Rush and over the years? As far as glacial melt, I mean, my understanding of glacial melt is you can detect in water with the chemistry whether or not it's glacial or ground. Is that correct based on the acidity and some other parameters?
That you sound like you know more about it than I do, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I know that the Park Service has a lot of historical photographs back from the Gold Rush days. I am personally interested in measuring some of this stuff. I want to get a fixed wing aircraft, radio controlled aircraft, to start gathering some imagery from above some of these glaciers that we know are retreating, just so we can have a record right now. And then moving forward, we can go back and take those photos again over the years and kind of watch how things are progressing, because especially with modern photogrammetry, you're able to not just get an overview map, but you can build 3-dimensional models from the photographs that you built. So, and that's an important thing in understanding the way that glaciers change, because you know you watch the end of a glacier shrink back, and you know that can be significant, but a lot of the shrinking actually happens in a vertical sense. So. Whether or not that's part of this project, I don't know, but I know that I would like to collect those data so that we can see how things look moving forward.
Yeah, I don't think it would be part of the project, but one thing that I think the project could help with is linking some of your questions to other scientists and getting interest from other scientists. There's the USGS the US Geologic Survey is investing in landslide research, you know, more money into landslide research. And they have someone in Alaska, Dennis Staley, I think his name is, who is also a connector and can also connect some of these research questions. So I think that's, you know, something we could be helpful with. I don't think we wouldn't be doing that kind of research, but I think we would be helpful.
Perfect.
Such good questions.
Should we maybe take just a couple of minutes here at the end and talk about next steps? If you folks were interested in this work, where would you suggest that we go from here? one thing that some of the communities we've talked to have asked us for is maybe like a formal written agreement with the city or the tribal government. So that's something that we could help draft up and send to the right people. Or if there are other community groups you think that we should have conversations with, we'd love to know that too.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a government organization.
Yeah.
So the way, or I don't know, Annette, if you explain the structure.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean, so you should
Oh, well, just like
go for it.
structure of the project is, we have Annette as the project lead, the lead geoscientist, and then Central Council Tlingit Haida will have a community specialist who will be in charge of making sure that the community's needs are being met and touching base with individuals within those communities. And the way we've thought this structure up, and again, open to, modification, but is that each community would have a community connector, and that person is selected by the community. Obviously, you know your community better than we do. And so you would, your community in some capacity would pick that person. And for some communities, that's someone who's already working in the natural resource department at a tribal office, or other communities, it's like a retired science teacher who has time. And that community connector would be responsible for, when the scientists do come to town, kind of making sure they're connecting with the right people in the community and getting the word out. And that they would also kind of help connect the schools, the proper person at the school. Doesn't have to be the schools in general, but just like who is the, is there a science teacher they should be connecting with? And then occasionally looking at the equipment, running up and making sure the equipment's working, or doing a tech check on something. And that, like I said, that doesn't have to be a proper government entity, but that the other communities that we've been working with so far we have memorandums of understanding with tribal government or the city government. And then they've agreed, as part of that agreement, they've agreed to pick a community connector, that gets a stipend. It's a small contract. It's a few thousand a year. But I don't think it's a huge job, but it's someone who's basically saying, like, I will answer your calls and I will, check in on the equipment and that sort of thing.
Well, I definitely think one good next step would be to possibly rope in the city assembly on this. Maybe give a presentation at an assembly meeting if that can be arranged. Certainly not doing our presentation on the sunniest day that we've seen in a couple of weeks. Those deter people from wanting to get onto a Zoom call. But I do think that I think that people would be interested in this if they knew about it. So I think just spreading the word as much as we can at this point, and definitely connecting with the municipality seems like a good direction.
Okay, and do you think we're happy to do that, and I promise not to get the time wrong. But do you think the municipality would be the one entity, or do you think the tribe would be the entity that would come up with the connector? Or do you have a sense of that?
I kind of always pictured myself as the connector, because I work with the school and I work with the municipality and I love gadgets. So I mean, if you need somebody to go do a tech check, I'm your guy. But that all just depends on how things roll out over the next year or so, with as far as how busy we are in tribe.
Okay, well, that sounds great to me, Ruben, and we're happy to reach out to the city, and maybe like we could do something short, or I don't know what would be appropriate for a city and borough assembly meeting in Skagway.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard of a presentation being given over like a distance presentation given, but I can't imagine that it would be the strangest thing to ever happen at an assembly meeting. Demetra also suggests doing an interview with the Skagway News, which I think would be certainly a good idea. Also, the local radio station KHNS has a great reporter right here in town that I'm sure would love to interview and tell the story about this, gets it out to a much wider audience. Paul says connecting with the municipality of Skagway is a good next step, but STC is clearly a leader in the community as well. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, this is wonderful suggestions.
This is great.
Well, if people don't have any more questions, I'm happy to give you my email, or you have my email, I think, Ruben. And people can email us if they have other questions. And other than that, I think we'll just take your direction and reach out to these entities that you suggested.
That's perfect. Yeah, if you guys want to drop your emails into the chat. And then Paul also asked, will you be presenting to Haines or have you already? Because I think it's kind of a consensus that the Haines community should be, by all means, very interested in this sort of project just because of the events that happened back in 2020.
Yes, we have both Haines and Cluck-Wan, and working with the avalanche person there, Eric. What's Eric's last name? But anyway, yeah. So we have definitely connected with Haines and Cluck-Wan.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm a little disappointed that we didn't have our local avalanche experts join us for this call. They just may not have had the time to do it, but we do have a group that goes up and clears and triggers landslides up in the pass and along the railroad that I think would be a perfect group to link into this, just because they're boots on the ground. They're up there all the time checking on conditions.
That would be great. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of this hopefully as a long-term relationship. And so we'll have time to connect with those people.
Perfect. Well, does anybody else have any questions or comments, or want to do a song and dance, or teach us how to make pasta, or no?
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks so much for presenting to us, and we're looking forward to seeing how this progresses. And let's definitely stay in touch and try to link in with municipality and KHNS. And
okay, that sounds great.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for organizing, Ruben.
Oh, of course, piece of cake. I just sit in my office chair and push the Zoom button.
Beautiful.
Okay, well, bye.
All right, folks. We'll see you the next time. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.